Today we're going to continue with language. I'm sharing my screen here, so hopefully you see the title slide, and we're going to be talking about language today. Here's some vocabulary that we're going to go over today. You can write this down now. If you want to pause the video, you're welcome to do that. But this is kind of an outline of where we're going. You could come back to this as well when we get to the end, just to review. I'm going to pause for a moment, then I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to start with the different elements of language. We can think about language sounds, and while we might be familiar with the sounds that language make, you're familiar with the alphabet, with syllables. When we talk about language, psycholinguistics, when we talk about the psychology of language, we use phonemes as the smallest unit of sound, and I'll talk more about those in the next few slides. Then we're going to move on to meaning, and for meaning of language, we can talk about the lexicon, and this is basically vocabulary, but it's also words and expressions. So it's not just what's in the dictionary, it's what's in your head that matches the sounds and shapes of letters and words into what they mean in your head. So again, today we're going to be emphasizing that the rules and meanings of language are in your head, not just what's in dictionary or in a grammar book. The next part of the meaning of language is syntax. Again, these are rules for putting words together, and yes, it is grammar, but it's more than that, and you'll have some grammatical rules that are in your head that you don't realize, that you've never learned, and are probably not in typical grammar books. We'll go over some of those in the next few minutes. And then finally, for meaning, we're going to talk about a situation model, that when you read language, when you hear language, you have in your head a set of concepts and a situation of what is a larger context that language takes place in. So we'll give some examples of that, but it's basically a big model in your head that when you're listening to language, you're making not just the meaning of those particular words, but you're making a whole model of the situation that is taking place during that language. Finally, language is very social. We are social critters. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Humans are social critters, and we're going to talk about some of the social elements of language, that when we're making speech sounds, when we're communicating by language, we are thinking socially about who we're communicating to. This is why it's so awkward now, because I'm communicating to a stupid little camera and not to your beautiful smiling faces out there, which is really unnatural. It's not a usual language situation. Usually we look at people's eyes, we look at their expressions, and we have some idea of what they're thinking when we're talking. And so language is social communication, which is one of the reasons this kind of communication I'm doing right now is uniquely difficult, and I'm doing the best that I can. Okay, thanks. So we're going to go on to the next one. I'll pause for a moment at end of each slide, and you can decide to pause it there if you want to take notes, or you can just let the video run and it'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's a fun little example of how rules in your head, the language rules in your head, are not the same as maybe the language rules you've learned in school. So this is a cartoon from XKCD written by Randall Monroe, and he's noting that when we add a curse word in the middle of another word, there's actually a set of rules about where that word belongs. And this is an example of a linguistic concept called tmesis, which is when we're putting a word inside another word. So if I say abso-frickin-lutely, that sounds right. But ab-frickin-salutely does not sound right, and absolute-frickinly does not also sound right. Why is it that there's actually, within a word, there's a certain spot where it belongs? No one's ever told you that, but you've got a rule in your head about where, where words belong when you put them in other words. So a whole nother level is a whole nother level. It's not another whole level. When you say something's fan-fucking-tastic, it's not fantastic fucking dick, right? Like, so there are rules for this that are in your head. It's kind of fun that we can talk about curse words here. Psychologists study this. There are research papers about how we decide this, and it seems like this is actually one of those rules that has to do with the sound of words in terms of how many syllables you've got left. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the sounds of words and perceiving speech sounds. The big concept here, the big important concept, is that phonemes are not only in the sound. Yes, I've got a microphone right here, and it is recording the sound of my voice. It's recording that and saving it, and then you are playing the sounds in your headphones or in your laptop speakers or wherever you're playing them. But the point of this is that the sounds that are played and the sounds that are recorded are not really exactly all of the sounds. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to sometimes slow down my speech and pronounce every single syllable. And that'll give you an example of how annoying this would be, because we don't actually speak like that, right? So when I say, but we don't actually speak like that, I'm not pronouncing all of the syllables. I'm saying, but we don't actually. I'm not saying, but we don't actually speak like that. I'm saying, but we don't actually speak like that. And when I do that, I'm skipping a bunch of phonemes. I'm mumbling and slurring some, and you are filling those in. So the point of that is that I'm able to create the phonemes in your head, even though I'm not putting all of them into the sound. So notice right there, all of them in the sound. If you went back and listened to only that part, it would sound like all of them in the, right? But in this case, you're able to correctly interpret all of them in the as all of them into the. Okay, the second point is that we learn phonemes in our native language. So part of learning language when you're a child or when you're learning a new language is that you're learning the phonemes and you're learning how to hear the phonemes. You're learning the physical difference in the sounds between ba and ma and pa and those kinds of sounds. And all the syllables, all the phonemes in your native language. There is a lot of research on whether there's a critical period, whether after a certain age it becomes much harder to learn a language. It certainly is easier to learn languages when you're young, and it does fall off. It seems to fall off in your teens, but there's not really a hard and fast, oh, after age 10, you're never gonna sound like a native speaker, or after age 15. It does seem like it falls off, so that if you're 35, it's going to be much harder to sound like a fluent speaker than if you learn when you're 5. So earlier is better, because young children have basically have brains that are optimized for learning certain things, and languages really one of them. Another thing about learning phonemes in your native language is that a lot of accents are due to hearing differences, not in kind of the shape we make our tongues. So when people who learn different languages have accents, it's partly because they can't hear the difference between different phonemes. Okay, so here we've got we're going to give this a try. I've got some sounds here, and these are going to be examples of how the phonemes are, as I said, in your head. They're not always in the sound. And so this is going to be an example of, you're going to get to experience how your mind fills in the phonemes even when they're not there. Okay, so I'm going to start with the multiple restoration effect. So this is an example where I'm going to play a sound, and it's going to be a sentence, and that sentence has been kind of digitally doctored to remove, I think it's every 1/10 of a second. And you're going to hear the sentence repeated a number of times. And when that sentence is repeated, as it's repeated, they're going to fill in those gaps of silence. So there's silence inserted every 1/10 of a second, for a 1/10 of a second. And it's going to sound very staccato at the beginning, like that. And then it's going to fill in with white noise. This will get a little bit annoying. Try to adjust your volume now. It'll get a little bit loud, so you might want to adjust your volume down. And it's going to insert white noise into those gaps. And what's going to happen, I'm going to play it a couple times, and what's going to happen is your mind is going to be able to use that white noise to fill in what phonemes belong there. Okay, so again, I'm going to play this a couple of times. Try to think about what that sentence is.
Morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. Morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. Morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight.
Okay, so at the end, that was the same sentence. Some of you might have gotten it, some might have not. I'm going to play it one more time, and then I'm going to tell you what the sentence is.
The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight.
Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what the sentence is. Hopefully some of you have gotten it. I'm going to tell you what the sentence is, and I'll play it just once more, just the first part. So the sentence is, the morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. So now when I play it, this is the same sound you've heard in the past minute or so, and you're going to be able to fill in because your mind now knows what phonemes belong where.
The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight. The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon or tonight.
What you'll notice there is that the first time, there's no P's in paper. The sound that goes with those two P's is not actually in that sound file. But by the time I play it the third time and you know what's supposed to go there, it's very easy to hear the morning paper pretty clearly. An interesting little fact about this demonstration is that this kind of memory lasts a really long time for hearing sounds like this. So even if in years to come you've thought of many different things, you've forgotten everything about this class, if you hear this sound again, your mind will still be able to fill in the P's of paper. Got another example. This is where I've made my own. And we can see that when I've taken out gaps every 1/10 of a second, we can just hear this. This doesn't have any white noise.
A fundamental rule of perception is that we reduce uncertainty by using context.
I'll play it once more.
A fundamental rule of perception is that we reduce uncertainty by using context.
Okay, And that sentence was,
a fundamental rule of perception is that we reduce uncertainty by using context.
and now if I play the one with the gaps again, your mind can fill in the gaps.
A fundamental rule of perception is that we reduce uncertainty by using context.
So what we're seeing there is that when the phonemes aren't in the sound, our mind is able to fill in using context, using guesses and hints about what we think is there. Normally, when we listen to regular language, we're doing that all the time based on what we think the speaker might say, or based on what we think what words belong in that spot. In this case, when things are without context, you need a little bit more of a hint.
The morning paper didn't say anything about rain this afternoon.
A fundamental rule of perception is that we reduce uncertainty by using context.
There we go. Okay. All right, another example of this is we can actually degrade the speech. So even when speech sounds are degraded, and this is when all of the sound is degraded, we can still hear the sounds when we know what to listen for. And this is kind of related to what I said about mumbling, right? So even if I'm going to mumble some of these words, so even if I'm going to, right? So and I said right there, even if I'm going to, if you heard that independently, you might not know what it said, but since it was in the context of a larger sentence that made sense, you were able to fill that in. This is an example of a digitally degraded speech called sine wave speech. And when we know what to listen for, we can hear what they say. So I'm going to play the sentence first as sine wave speech.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
So that's kind of sounds like a robot, doesn't really sound like an English sentence. I'm going to try it once more.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
Okay, anyone have a guess about what was said? All right, now we're going to listen to the sentence clearly.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
Okay, now you can listen to the first sound.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
And it sounds pretty clear, doesn't it? Maybe not totally clear, but you can hear what that sentence was, whereas the first two times you could not. These examples are from Matt Davis at Cambridge University. You can click on the link to see more and listen more.
Jazz and swing.
Okay, so now we're moving on to meaning. And for meaning, we can talk about syntax, that is the rules by which the words go together. We can talk about lexicon in terms of the vocabulary of the words. And then we can also talk about the situation model. That's the whole situation that's depicted by the words, not just the word meanings, but a general situation. And I'm going to define these and give an example by a poem I read recently by Clint Smith. It was from last year, and the poem is entitled, When People Say We Have Made It Through Worse Before. You can see the link there, and I'm going to close the slideshow, and then I'll read the poem, and then I'll come back and discuss it. If you want to pause it here, you can also read the poem yourself from the link. Okay, so here's Clint Smith's poem, When People Say We Have Made It Through Worse Before. All I hear is the wind slapping against the gravestones of those who did not make it, those who did not survive to see the confetti fall from the sky, those who did not live to watch the parade roll down the street. I have grown accustomed to a lifetime of aphorisms meant to assuage my fears, pithy sayings meant to convey that everything ends up fine in the end. There is no solace in rearranging language to make a different word tell the same lie. Sometimes the moral arc of the universe does not bend in a direction that will comfort us. Sometimes it bends in ways we don't expect, and there are people who fall off in the process. Please, dear reader, do not say I am hopeless. I believe there is a better future to fight for. I simply accept the possibility that I may not live to see it. I have grown weary of telling myself lies that I might one day begin to believe. We are not all left standing after the war has ended. Some of us have become ghosts by the time the dust has settled. Okay, so I thought that was quite a powerful poem, for me at least, but also I wanted to talk about how we can use that poem as to talk about syntax, lexicon, and situation model. So if we just took the first stanza, all I hear is the wind slapping against the gravestones of those who did not make it, those who did not survive to see the confetti fall from the sky. When we talk about syntax, it's the way that that sentence is constructed. All I hear is the wind slapping against the gravestones. There's a certain syntax chosen there. The wind slapping against the gravestones is the correct way of making that syntactic sentence in English. So you wouldn't say the wind against slapped gravestones even though all those words might mean the same. Syntax gives us rules for putting those together. In fact, another syntactically correct way of doing that sentence would be the gravestones had the wind slapped against them. Now that means a little bit something different, but that would also be syntactically correct in terms of the rules of how we form sentences. In terms of lexicon, that's the word meanings, words and phrase meanings. So the wind slapping against the gravestones, in that case, the lexicon of slapping is a little bit unusual word there. And we consult the lexicon in our head to think, okay, wind can slap, but wind doesn't have hands, which usually slap, but that's a kind of colorful prose choice that Clint Smith chose there. Similarly, those who did not make it, for our lexicon, it's not just vocabulary, right? In this case, what we're saying is those who did not make it, the gravestones of those who did not make it, means that we know about gravestones and we know what did not make it means in this case. Even though it doesn't say anyone has died in that sentence, we can use our lexicon to figure that out. Finally, the situation model of those who did not survive to see the confetti fall from the sky, those who did not live to watch the parade roll down the street, that evokes a certain situation in our head. Confetti falling from the sky. It didn't say anything about the weather that day, but victorious parades rolling down the street, we might imagine a sunny day. We might imagine a big city of a parade and confetti falling from the sky, evoking perhaps victory parades at the end of World War II. Clint Smith is evoking that situation model in your head by the words that he's chosen here. So again, when we talk about the meaning of language, we're talking about the syntax, lexicon, and situation model. And again, each of these are rules in your head, not necessarily, although they relate to the grammar rules that you've learned in English, vocabulary, but your mind goes well beyond a lot of those grammatical rules and vocabulary to form the full situation and get the whole meaning of the language. Okay, the next part I'd like to talk about is the social communication of language. And language is a social activity. When we talk with someone, we're looking, as I mentioned, we're looking at their their eye contact, their facial expressions. But we also have in mind what kind of things they know. We have in mind what kind of things they might be interested in. And people who study language, the psychology of language, have terms for these. So the first term is audience design, and that is the idea that when we are speaking to someone, we are designing what we say for the audience, for that particular audience. So it could be a one-on-one conversation, it doesn't have to be up on a stage, but when we're having a one-on-one conversation, we're thinking about what that person knows, what their needs and desires are, what their expectations for this language situation are. And we're kind of doing all this kind of in the background and sort of effortlessly. Sometimes it's more effortful, but often we're designing what we say with a particular view towards who we're speaking to and who we're communicating with. So that's audience design. The second concept here for the social communication of language is called common ground. Common ground is what we assume that the people we're speaking to understand and their common background of knowledge. So a good way of remembering this is common background of knowledge. So when I'm speaking to a group at Randolph-Macon and I say, so I went to have a meeting at the Brock Center. I'm assuming that you all know what the Brock Center is, what kind of building that is. And in fact, since we have 2 Brock Centers on campus, if I said I went to work out at the Brock Center, you might say, oh, he means the gym. And if I said I had a meeting at the Brock Center, you might assume I meant the Brock Student Center. So this is, if I was speaking to an audience at Randolph-Macon, I would assume that you had background knowledge about the layout of campus and how we commonly refer to different buildings. I thought a great example of some of these concepts of audience design and common ground is one of my favorite clinical psychologists on YouTube, Ali Mattu. He has a channel called The PSYC Show, which I highly recommend. And just yesterday or the day before, I believe, he was explaining emotions to his daughter, who is very young. I believe she's 3 or 4. And he was using the emotions from Inside Out, the movie, and he had little figures, but he was explaining them to his daughter, designing what he was saying for the audience of his daughter. But you also notice he's designing for the YouTube audience, right? So he's using words that his daughter might understand, but he's also designing his message for all of us on YouTube who are watching him. So I'll ask you to watch that video. It's about 6 minutes long, and think about how he's designing what to say for his daughter and for us, and also what he's assuming we know about. So he's taking some common background of we know what certain words mean, and he's assuming that we all have a certain kind of knowledge. So I'm going to pause here, and you can click on that link and go watch the YouTube video of Ali Mattu. Okay, we're back. So now I'm going to move on to a few other concepts in language covered in the chapter, and some kind of interesting modern debates about language. The first is called the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Another word for this concept is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. They're both the same thing. Sapir-Whorf are 2 of the investigators who've kind of pioneered this hypothesis. And the basic idea I've put at the bottom there. The question is, does the language that we speak shape the thoughts that we can have? Does language shape thought? Obviously, what we're thinking shapes the words that we choose, right? So thought is expressed through language, but the question is, does language also shape thought? Another way of putting this is that we dissect nature along lines laid down by our native language. Language is not simply a reporting device for an experience, but a defining framework for it. So is language just a window into thought, or does language actually shape thought? There's a long history of research into this. The original research was wondering whether the words that people had for different colors in their native language, whether those shaped what colors they saw. And that research has gone up until the modern day, and it seems like it does a little bit. So some languages are more likely to have many different words kind of at boundaries of blue and green. So if you have a lot of words for blue and green, you might draw that, that boundary as to what is green and what is blue at a slightly different spot. So if I showed you a blue swatch versus a green one, you might call something blue or call something green in a slightly different place than a language that had different set of words for those colors. But those effects are very subtle. More recently, a scientist at Stanford, a psychologist at Stanford named Lara Boroditsky, has also done some research on language shaping thought, and I think her findings are very interesting. I'll go over those on the next slide. So she has studied the Pormpuraaw language, which is language of an Aboriginal Australian tribe, and they have an interesting set of conventions in their language, such that they don't have frequent use of relative directional terms. So what that means is that they use cardinal directions far more often than left or right. It's much more of an awkward thing to say in their language, left or right, that they don't really use those words. They use north and south and east and west. So if you were speaking to this young woman pictured, you might say, hey, you have a bird on your southeastern shoulder. Well, for me, I guess I'm in my office right now. That would be, yeah, that would be her southern shoulder. Right now, as a way of thinking about this, try to point east. So if you are a native English speaker, like I am, and like most of us are, who are listening to this class, you're not used to the habit of walking around knowing where north, where south, where east, and where west is. And so that's a kind of difficult task. For speakers of this language, they've built up the habit of always doing that. When they walk into a place, they know which direction is north and south. So it's a much more effortless thing to do, to refer to those directions in language. So in this way, it does actually shape their thought. Those habits of thought shape how they're able to maintain cardinal directions and refer to them in their language. I'd highly encourage you to check out the TED Talk from Lara Boroditsky. She has a number of other examples that are really fascinating about how this group, how their thought is slightly different because they use cardinal directions rather than relative directions. Finally, I wanted to end with a question about whether language is unique for humans. This is also an ongoing debate, and I'm probably going to make a slightly controversial claim in saying that humans have language, and it does seem unique to humans. But I'd like to clarify there that what I'm saying is a clear and precise definition of language. So we know that animals can communicate through sound. Birds can absolutely do this. A lot of animals make expressive sounds that communicate. It does seem like some apes can learn sign language. They can take arbitrary symbols or arbitrary gestures. So they can make signs and they can get that those symbols represent concepts or represent objects. So the ability to communicate with arbitrary symbols. So right now, that word apes, A-P-E-S, those are symbols. That's just, you know, black ink. Well, I guess it's not ink, right? Black screen against a white background. There's nothing about that S shape that naturally means it should sound like S. I know it seems like, of course it does, because we've all learned English, but this is not the case in every other language. And so symbols are arbitrary. What letters mean is arbitrary, and we've learned that connection. It seems like apes may be able to do that with some sign and gestures. However, this is a difference between humans and every other expressive communication that we can tell from the animal kingdom, the rest of the animal kingdom, is that using syntactic and morphological rules, meaning using syntax to combine lots of different words into lots of different combinations, using that kind of temesis that we talked about earlier, that really seems unique. Humans may, in their first couple years of life, grunt and say, give me that banana, I want this, I want that. But by the time they're 5 or 6, they are creating magnificently different sentences. They're combining the words that they know into a universe of different sentences. And this does not seem to happen with other animals that learn some language. So this is Nim Chimpsky, one of the apes who's learned some signs. And these are the most common signs of Nim. Eat, drink, eat, drink, eat, nim, right? So it's basically a lot of simple orders and requests. There's not a lot of complexity in building sentences inside other sentences of the kind that you even probably heard earlier in Ali Matou's daughter, of a young daughter with not that many words, but with able to kind of form some interesting sentences that you wouldn't see here. I have a link for Hoover the seal up there, and this is an interesting story. Hoover the seal was a baby seal who was, I believe, abandoned by his mother, or he was stranded on a beach in Maine, and a Maine lobsterman found the baby seal and nursed him back to health in his bathtub. As the baby seal grew and ate and grew and ate, the Maine lobsterman figured out, and this is in the 1960s and 70s, figured out that Hoover was outgrowing the bathtub. And so he called the New England Aquarium, and the New England Aquarium came and got Hoover and gave Hoover a new home at the aquarium. However, Hoover had been listening to the Maine lobsterman and had learned how to express some sounds similar to the ones that he had heard. Here is some sounds of Hoover the seal. I love it. So you might be able to hear Hoover saying, hey, 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 get over here, in a thick, New England Maine accent, which was actually probably what he heard the lobsterman say when he got out of the bathtub, right? Hey, get over here. And Hoover was able to imitate that. And when Hoover was in the aquarium, he was able to use those utterances and to the delight of visitors at the aquarium. However, Hoover did not know what get over here meant. He just was able to imitate as get over here. So in that case, he's able to communicate through sound, but he's not able to generate lots of different sentences using syntactical rules. Okay, I hope all this recorded well and that you're able to watch it and watch the associated links. Thank you for your attention.
Hey,